So for our first watercolor class in the watercolor landscape series, we started with a bunch of exercises, just technical exercises. The first one that we did that was a little more of an artwork and less of a technical exercise is this set of rainbow trees. The goal for this one is to experiment with the difference between wet paint on wet paper, which will run and be less controlled, and then wet paint on dry paper, which is much easier to control. This is a great exercise for checking out a new palette, and since we are starting this particular series of classes with a brand new palette, I had all of my students do these trees. It's also a very useful way to practice trees, which are one of the most important elements in creating landscapes. So I'm starting with a very saturated color. We'll explain more what that means in our second class in this series, but I'm taking a very dark color, very saturated with pigment, lots of paint in my water, and I'm making this tree. We're working with pine trees here because it's a fairly simple shape, and it's also one that allows you to develop your own personal style very quickly and practice using the brush. I've taken the bottom half of the paper and I've used a big mop brush, or in class we are using our largest square brush just to put water on the bottom half of the paper. The top half I'm leaving dry, and then I'm going to take pigment straight out of my palette with this crimson red in this case, and I'm putting it into my tree. And you can see the difference between the wet paper and the dry paper very clearly. The wet paper is taking that pigment and running with it. It's going all over the place. I'm going to take my trunk one more time, make it a little bit darker here. And then I'm going to switch colors. So this is giving me a chance to experiment with a new palette. This one clearly is an older palette, but when you get new sets of colors, this is a nice way to see what each one does. Take half of your paper wet, half of your paper dry, and then you're going to take your wet paint onto your dry paper in a very controlled way. And when you get down to the half of the paper that is wet, it's going to be less controlled, and you'll start to see what will happen when you put the paint onto that wet paper. This can be one of the most frustrating things when you are first using watercolors, because the beauty of the watercolor is very much in the randomness of what the water will do to your pigment. So I'm going to go pretty quickly here. If I were doing this just by myself, I'd spend a little bit more time making my trees exactly the way I want them to be. But I just want you to get a good idea of what I'm doing with this exercise. Now, if I wanted to experiment with all of my colors, I would go through systematically and use every single one in the palette. And I might do this on several sheets of paper if I have a larger palette. That gives me a chance to see what happens with this pigment and with that pigment. So I've got a nice spring green here. This one's very pretty. It's mixing with my yellow really nicely. It's mixing with my water pretty nicely. It's going very dark. I love the way it looks when I use it in a less saturated way over here and down here where the colors are lighter. I'm going to jump over here to a blue. I think this one is a phthalo, which is one of my favorite blues. Perhaps it's a cobalt blue, but it's one of the darker ones, and it's going to be one that's really good to mix neutrals with, which we'll talk about a lot more in later classes. So each tree is going to be a different color. We're working with this bright, bright rainbow, and we're just seeing what happens, not being too particular with where we put our paint or how we put it on there, just the idea that it's a tree. Now this palette, unlike the ones we're using in class, has a beautiful pre-mixed purple. So I'm going to go ahead and use that for my final tree here. You'll notice that my trees, some of them are taller, some of them are shorter, starting with that trunk so I know where the center of everything is, and mixing up a good dark purple to put the needles on these pine trees here. And then I'm very casual and loopy about where I put my branches. I'm having a lot of fun with this. And as we get down here, you can see that the paper has dried out quite a bit, and I'm getting some dry brush down here, which is another technique that we'll be talking about a little bit more. So this is what this exercise looks like. It's experimenting with the difference between the wet paint on the wet paper, the wet paint on the dry paper, and then the way that these colors mix together as we go next to each other. Give that one a try. Even if you did it in class, it's worth doing again. And let me know what you think.